Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. My name's William. This is a Set of Corsa Competizione, and today I'm going to be driving around a rather soggy Nürburgring for a pretty different video. Today I'm going to be looking at the wet preset and comparing it to a dry setup I've made around a wet track. So seeing if I can make the dry setup, if the dry setup with wet tires is better than the wet presetup, or the wet preset, I should say, and if it's not, then or if it's at least comparable, I'm going to see if I can make some minor tweaks and adjustments to it to actually make it faster than the wet preset, or if it's just a case if you're racing in the rain, you need to make a full wet setup or just use the wet preset if you don't have something else. I suspect I'll be able to get the dry setup pretty darn close to the wet preset. And realistically, kind of thinking about it, I think it's going to be pretty small tweaks to make a dry setup that I'm quite happy with in the dry, make it actually faster than the wet preset in the rain, and kind of talk through that because it's really not as hard from my experience as a lot of people kind of think it is and think you have to completely readjust the car for the rain. So I'm going to test that today. I might be completely wrong. Either way, I'm going to share it with you guys. We'll go ahead and load up the wet preset, and I'm going to lower the fuel to 30 liters just because that is what my dry setup's on. Other than that, not going to change anything. I'm going to go set a benchmark lap, kind of talk to you through my hot lap in the wet setup before we get on into the rest of it. Alright, starting the first lap here on the wet preset. I'll say I already adjusted the traction control down from what it was set on originally for the wet preset, as it was maxed, and the car basically doesn't exit out of the corner at all. You can see how much we're in it still right there. I don't really feel like it's saving me. It's more or less just not letting me get power down, but that's part of the wet preset, so we'll go ahead and keep it that way for the sake of the comparison. A lot of understeer there. I feel like the ABS is too aggressive as well. The track is wet, but there's still grip out here for sure. I mean, your tires are going to be, if you're on wet tires and they're up to good temperature, they're pretty soft. You should be getting good grip out of them. If anything, it's just skatey, a little bit skatey, and in the high-speed stuff and under braking, the tires kind of move around a little bit more, and so the car can move around a little bit more. You need it a little bit more planted or a little bit more compliant in the suspension settings. But ultimately, like this setup doesn't feel, or this wet preset does not feel too bad. It's definitely very drivable. I don't know exactly how fast it's going to be compared. I do get some high-speed understeer on turn-in that I'm really not a fan of. It's kind of keeping me from putting the car exactly where I want it to go. But for the most part, it's just the electronic aids being a little bit too much interference. I think it's really kind of holding the time back in the car, but other than that, just understeer. Just a little bit too much understeer from the car. It feels like it's a little too safe, but we'll see ultimately. Come across the line there for a 2:07.5 on the wet preset. Let's take a look real quick at the sector times before we go into driving the dry setup with wet tires. So 1 minute 0.8 sector 1, 47.7 for sector 2, and a 19, we'll call that a 19 flat to kind of even it out, for sector 3 on the wet preset. So on to the dry setup. I'll go ahead and load it. You can see here, dry setup. Talk about a couple things here real quick. We'll go ahead and put the tires on wet and basically leave everything alone. So there's two things I know I'm already needing to change on this setup. It's not as easy as just going from one dry setup to wet track and just putting wet tires on it. These electronic aids, these are going to be probably too aggressive. I'm going to go ahead and try them on my outlap, but I'm probably going to bump the number up. Generally, a good rule of thumb for me is to double them. So 2 is what I normally run around in on race conditions in this car. So I'm gonna probably bump them to 4. That's what I would do right now if I wasn't just trying to get a like-for-like comparison. And also this brake bias. This brake bias is going to be way too far forward for the rain. It's super easy to for the front wheels to want to lock up. So I'm basically just going to be in ABS the entire time. I would normally just look at the wet presetups or the wet presets brake bias and copy it over to my dry setup. But for the sake of comparison, for right now, I'm going to run it like this as well. So let's get out on track. Alright, so starting the lap here on the dry setup with almost no adjustments. I did increase the traction control to 4 on the outlap. I just wanted to try and give it more of a fair shake compared to the wet preset. 2's very aggressive for these conditions. It's mostly down to my right foot at that point on 2. I need a little bit more help than that, as I have a lead foot when it comes to the throttle pedal. The understeer, for the most part, is much better than the wet preset. I am a little bit less confident in the car through the high-speed corners and on turn-in braking. You can see already we're about 4/10 up through the first part of the track. We'll see how it does this time around through the Schumacher S. It was quite skatey last time. We're running less downforce right now than we are on the wet preset. So it feels fine there, but the second I put the power down, I can really feel the back start moving around. For some, that might be drivable, and depending on the conditions, you know, you can definitely put up with that if you know the track's going to continue to dry out. The rain's going to stay constant. You're out here with a bunch of other cars that are going to be dry in the track as you go, but that is not the case for me. Just trying to go through what the shortcomings are of it and what I would do to address them in this situation, and ultimately we'll see if it winds up making an improvement. See here, we're up on the time a little bit, little slide, a little too much of a slide, about 3/10. Looks like we lost some out of the final corner. But either way there, a little bit of an improvement. Let's see, we went purple sector 1, purple sector 2, just barely in sector 2, and then about a 10th off in sector 3, so I do think it hurt over those curbs in sector 3 and the last corner, that little bit of a slide. I think I'm going to play with the electronic adjustments and stuff like that to try and get it better. But even with less wing, more aggressive suspension, everything like this, the sector 2, the high-speed stuff, we're right there with it. And sector 1, we were actually 4/10 faster than the wet preset right out of the gate. So let's go tweak with it. So looking at the setup here, this is what I think I'm going to go ahead and do. I think I'm going to bump my traction control up. I think I'm gonna go to 6, and I'm just gonna slightly increase the ABS. I'm gonna go to 3 on the ABS. I am going to go ahead and do that trick I was talking about before. Not really a trick, it's just a time saver. I'm going to use the wet presets brake bias for this dry setup. There might be a better one in between, but this is just, you know, throwing it together quickly. Let's see if it's better than the wet preset rather than just building completely from scratch. We're already a little bit faster, but I think I can make the car quite a bit faster here if we try. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the downforce on this car. This is basically something you're almost always going to do in the rain, unless you know it's only going to rain for a couple minutes, and then for the rest of your 2-hour race or something, it's going to be dry. But if you're going to race and you know it's going to be wet for at least a while, running more downforce is going to be a little bit helpful. So just to recap, I just increased the splitter by 1 click up from 7 millimeters to 8 millimeters, rear wing from 7 to 9, brake bias from about 58.2, I think that's where it was, 58.2 to 51%, and traction control from 4 to 6, ABS from 2 to 3. That's all I'm changing. I'm not changing any wheel rates. I'm not changing any dampers. I'm not changing any camber angles, anything like that. Let's go see what it'll do now. Alright, starting our lap here on the dry setup with the adjustments, the small little adjustments, and see what difference it makes. It'll be pretty noticeable with the brake bias here. Turn 1. Much better getting the car stopped. Really felt I could attack the brakes. Braking zone there. Much better turn in from the car on brakes. Pretty half a second up. Probably lose a little bit of it here. Nope, we're gaining still 0.6 up over the time. That's crazy. It really doesn't take a whole lot. It's just being comfortable with the car. Being able to place the car where you want it to go. Drivability matters so much more in the wet. It matters in the dry quite a bit. Consistency, but speed in the wet. It's pretty huge. 1.3 seconds up after the Schumacher S. Felt much better through there. The rotation on corner entry is so much better. There's a lot less understeer here. That downforce over just driving the dry setup, that little added downforce that it did there, really making the car more consistent, squirm around a little bit less, especially in the high-speed stuff. It's still sketchy on those curbs. I don't really think there's anything I can do about that, other than avoid them, which I'm doing a terrible job at. Come around the last corner here. Yeah, we're 1.6 something seconds faster. Let's take a look at the sector times here so we can break it down and get an idea of exactly how much faster it was in each part of the track. Now let's see, you can see here almost a full second faster in Sector 1. I don't know what I just did there. Yeah, almost a full second faster in Sector 1, which we had already improved 0.4 on just on the dry setup. Half a second faster, which we had kind of equaled half a second faster than the dry setup with the adjustments. And then actually just barely faster than the wet preset through the final sector. It's just missing those curbs in that final sector. If I could get that line down, but my brain's so hardwired into hitting those curbs the way you do in the dry, that would take a lot of retraining for me to be able to figure that one out. But you can see, I mean, a little bit of it is just spending time on the wet track and kind of getting comfortable with the way it feels. I'm sure some of it's down to just me improving, but the car felt so much better to drive in that situation. And just, I mean, the massive gain of, you know, half a second with no adjustments from the dry setup over the wet preset, and then being able to put basically 1.3 seconds from the dry setup with adjustments here over the wet preset, and half a second through the middle sector where it's all high-speed stuff too. I definitely do think there is something to the wet presets. If you absolutely know you're going to be driving in the rain, you don't have a good dry setup, I think that those are good there. They're almost always too aggressive on the electronic aids. So your traction control, your ABS, you don't need to run them that aggressive in the rain. At least for me, I want them to step in and keep me from dying, basically, but I don't want them keeping the car from really accelerating at all out of the corners. And you can see here running the ABS on 3 and the traction control on 6, where the wet preset wanted me running 11 traction control and 8 ABS. It's just really not needed in in these kind of conditions anyways. And ultimately, I don't want to just say like downright that adjusting a dry set is going to be faster than the wet preset, but in certain situations you can see how little I changed there. The downforce, the brake bias, and the obviously the tires, but then the ABS and the TC, and getting a better feel out of the car and a much better time. So hopefully that kind of answered that question for you guys, if you were wondering, or at least provide a little bit of insight into what you can do if you have a good dry setup and you're all of a sudden racing in the rain, and you don't just want to throw that away. It's pretty easy to tweak, and doesn't take a whole lot of time at all. Just a little bit of testing to kind of figure out what you need, and then some simple clicks in the garage without too much else, in all honesty. So I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye bye. Get it through this chicane a little bit cleaner. Oh, I missed. Yep, ran wide.